Being emotionally neutral makes avoidance chase you? Sounds almost backwards when you first hear it, because everything people are usually taught about love says the opposite, that more emotion should create more connection, that expressing more should bring someone closer, that showing how much you care should naturally pull them in. But in this dynamic, that logic quietly breaks down in ways most people don't notice until they've already been caught in the cycle, because there is a specific type of emotional pattern that reacts not to intensity, not to pursuit, not even to love itself, but to pressure. And when that pressure disappears, something unexpected happens inside the other person's system. Attention returns, curiosity returns, and sometimes what looks like distance turning into indifference is actually the exact moment the dynamic begins to flip. Before going deeper into that, if you've ever felt like the more you tried to get closer, the more someone pulled away, and you're tired of guessing wrong about what that means, make sure to subscribe, because this is exactly where we break down the psychology behind those patterns in a way that finally makes emotional sense instead of leaving you confused in circles. Now, emotional neutrality is one of those ideas that gets misunderstood immediately, because people hear neutral and assume it means cold, detached, uninterested, or emotionally shut down. But that's not what's happening here at all. Emotional neutrality is not the absence of feeling, it is the absence of emotional escalation. It's when your emotional state is no longer dictated by the other person's behavior in real time. No chasing highs when they give attention, no crashing lows when they pull away, no visible panic when things feel uncertain. Instead, there is a grounded presence that doesn't bend every time the dynamic shifts. And this is important because avoidant patterns are extremely sensitive to emotional escalation. They are built around regulating closeness through distance, and when they sense emotional pressure building on them, their instinct is to step back to regain internal control. So when someone stops feeding that escalation cycle, something in the dynamic starts to change almost immediately, even if it's not obvious at first. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how the avoidant nervous system operates in relational spaces. It is not that they don't feel deeply, it's that deep emotional intensity can feel destabilizing rather than comforting. Closeness, especially when it comes with emotional expectation or urgency, can register internally as pressure. And pressure triggers withdrawal not because of lack of care, but because of self-regulation. Their system is constantly trying to balance two competing needs, connection and autonomy. The moment connection feels like it's demanding too much emotional exposure too quickly, autonomy takes over. That's where distance comes in. But the key detail most people miss is that their withdrawal is not a full disconnection, it's a recalibration. They are not always leaving the emotion behind, they are stepping away from the intensity of it. And if intensity is the trigger, then calmness becomes the reset. This is why emotional intensity often backfires so dramatically in these dynamics. The more someone tries to prove love, explain feelings, or secure reassurance through repeated emotional expression, the more it can unintentionally amplify the internal pressure the other person feels. Because from the outside it looks like connection, but internally it can feel like emotional demand. And when emotional demand rises, curiosity drops, space increases, engagement becomes inconsistent, not because the feelings disappear, but because the system becomes overloaded. And this is where the shift begins, because once that pattern continues long enough, something very subtle starts to happen when you finally stop reacting in the same emotional way. The first real shift begins when you stop feeding the emotional feedback loop. Not in a performative way, not as a strategy, but in the simple sense that you no longer respond with escalation every time there is distance or inconsistency. You stop over-explaining. You stop chasing clarity in real time. You stop reacting as if every change in tone or timing is an emergency that needs immediate emotional correction. And when that happens, the dynamic suddenly loses something it was depending on: predictable emotional reaction. Because even avoidance depends on predictability in a strange way. If they expect pursuit, reassurance seeking, or emotional spikes, they unconsciously start structuring their distance around that expectation. But when that reaction disappears, they are no longer interacting with a predictable emotional pattern. They are interacting with something stable, something unreadable, something that doesn't escalate in response to their behavior. And that unpredictability creates curiosity in a way emotional intensity never could. And this is where the psychological gap begins to form, the space where everything starts to feel different without anything being explicitly said. Because now, when they pull away, there is no emotional chase behind them. When they return, there is no overwhelming emotional surge waiting for them. Instead, there is calmness, presence without pressure, awareness without escalation, and that creates a kind of emotional confusion, not in a chaotic sense but in a recalibrating sense, because the system they were previously engaging with is no longer responding in the same way. And when emotional responses stop matching expectations, attention naturally increases, not because they suddenly feel more, but because they can no longer predict the emotional environment they are stepping into. And in avoidant dynamics, unpredictability is not threatening in the way most people assume. It is intriguing, and once unpredictability enters the emotional environment, something very specific starts to happen in the background of their attention, because the mind naturally tries to resolve what it cannot easily categorize. When someone is used to receiving emotional signals that are loud, reactive, and highly expressive, they subconsciously learn how to navigate those patterns without much effort. But when that same system is met with emotional neutrality, where reactions are not exaggerated, where presence is steady, where emotional highs and lows are no longer feeding the dynamic, it creates a kind of cognitive pause, not confusion in a chaotic sense, but a recalibration where attention starts to increase simply because the usual emotional shortcuts no longer work. And in that space, curiosity begins to form again, not because they are overwhelmed, but because they can no longer predict what will happen next emotionally, and the human brain is wired to pay attention to what it cannot easily predict. And this is where something subtle but powerful begins to take shape, the emotional gap between expectation and reality. They expect reaction but receive calmness. They expect pursuit but find stillness. They expect emotional escalation but encounter emotional consistency instead. And over time, that gap becomes psychologically noticeable because the nervous system starts registering a mismatch between what it is used to and what it is now experiencing. This is not about manipulation or strategy, it is about contrast. Emotional systems, especially ones sensitive to intensity cycles, rely heavily on contrast to define meaning. Without contrast, patterns lose their familiarity, and when familiarity weakens, attention naturally returns to reassess the situation. That reassessment is where curiosity reactivates, and curiosity is often the first quiet step toward re-engagement. From there, the dynamic slowly starts to shift, not because anything dramatic has been done, but because emotional control over you is no longer accessible in the way it used to be. And this is one of the most important internal triggers in avoidant psychology because emotional control doesn't mean manipulation, it means predictability. When they can predict how you will respond, how you will react, how you will emotionally escalate or stabilize, they can subconsciously regulate their own distance and closeness with more confidence. But when that predictability disappears, when your emotional state no longer bends in response to their behavior, something shifts internally. They are no longer interacting with a reactive system, they are interacting with a stable one. And stability, when it is unfamiliar in emotional dynamics, becomes something the mind starts to reevaluate rather than dismiss. And what often follows this is the return of curiosity in very subtle ways. Not sudden declarations, not dramatic reappearances, but small behavioral shifts that indicate renewed attention. They might observe more quietly. They might check in indirectly. They might re-engage in ways that feel cautious rather than emotional. Because at this stage, they are not chasing intensity. They are testing accessibility. They are trying to understand whether the emotional environment is still the same as before or whether something fundamental has changed. And when they realize that emotional pressure is no longer present, that reactions are no longer escalated, and that presence no longer comes with emotional demand, something inside them starts to soften. Not into commitment, not into certainty, but into willingness to re-engage without feeling overwhelmed. This is also where the reversal of dynamics begins to become visible because what used to be a cycle of you reacting and them withdrawing slowly starts to shift into something else entirely. Your emotional neutrality creates space, and in that space they begin to re-enter. Not because they are forced, not because they are pressured, but because the environment no longer feels emotionally heavy in the same way. And when emotional heaviness decreases, approach behavior becomes more likely. But what makes this stage so interesting is that it doesn't feel like chasing in a traditional sense. It feels like re-engagement attempts that are cautious, indirect, and exploratory. Because they are not stepping into certainty, they are stepping into uncertainty that now feels safe enough to explore. And this is where emotional non-reactivity becomes one of the most powerful stabilizers in the entire pattern. Because non-reactivity is not about suppressing emotion, it is about not turning emotion into immediate external escalation. It is the ability to feel internally without immediately projecting urgency, fear, or attachment-driven behavior outward. And when that quality is present consistently, it creates an emotional environment that no longer feels volatile. And volatility is one of the main triggers for avoidance. So when volatility disappears, so does the instinct to withdraw. Instead, what emerges is something more measured, more cautious, but also more present. A willingness to stay in contact longer. A willingness to re-engage without immediately retreating afterward. Not because fear is gone, but because the emotional environment no longer activates it in the same way. And gradually, something begins to shift on their side as well. They start investing energy again, but in a different emotional tone than before. It is not the same intensity as early attraction, and it is not the same withdrawal pattern that defined avoidance. It becomes something in between, more stable, more deliberate, more observational. Effort begins to reappear in small ways, communication becomes slightly more consistent, and engagement feels less like a reaction and more like a choice. And while it may not yet be fully secure or fully open, it signals that the internal resistance that once controlled the dynamic is no longer dominating every interaction. Instead, it is being balanced by something else: curiosity, comfort, and a reduced sense of emotional pressure. And as that energy begins to return, something very important has to be understood about what is actually happening underneath it, because it is easy to mistake this stage for emotional certainty when in reality it is still a recalibration phase. What looks like growing consistency, slightly increased effort, and more intentional communication is often the nervous system testing whether the new emotional environment is stable enough to remain engaged in without triggering the old withdrawal response. In other words, they are not fully committing emotionally in the way people assume. They are slowly re-entering a space that no longer feels as pressurized as it once did, and that difference matters because it explains why the dynamic can feel like it is improving, yet still remain delicate. It is not a completed transformation, it is a reopening of access, and access in avoidant psychology is always conditional on emotional safety. But what sustains this shift is not intensity returning, it is consistency without escalation. Because once emotional neutrality is established as a stable presence, it becomes the reference point they begin to orient around. Before, emotional highs and lows defined the connection: how strongly someone reacted, how deeply they expressed, how quickly emotional energy shifted. Now that unpredictability is replaced with something more grounded, and that grounding changes how the nervous system engages with the connection. Instead of preparing for emotional overload, it begins to recognize that interaction no longer carries the same weight of pressure. And when pressure is reduced over time, engagement becomes less defensive and more exploratory. This is where effort begins to reappear, not as a reaction to emotional intensity, but as a response to emotional safety. And this is also where one of the most overlooked patterns becomes visible, which is that avoidant individuals often test the emotional stability of the person in front of them before increasing investment again. These tests are rarely obvious. They are not framed as intentional evaluations, but as subtle behavioral observations. They might withdraw slightly to see if pressure returns. They might reappear briefly to observe whether emotional escalation resurfaces. They might engage in low-effort communication just to gauge emotional reaction. And each of these interactions serves the same internal purpose: determining whether the environment is still safe enough to stay connected without feeling overwhelmed. Emotional neutrality, when genuine, disrupts these tests because there is nothing to provoke escalation. And when escalation does not occur, the system gradually starts to interpret the environment as more predictable. At this stage, the shift from avoidance toward engagement is not dramatic, but incremental. It is marked by subtle willingness rather than sudden openness. Communication becomes less fragmented, responses carry more presence, and there is a noticeable reduction in emotional withdrawal after interaction. But perhaps more importantly, there is less urgency to escape the interaction afterward. This is significant because in earlier phases, even positive connection could be followed by sudden distance due to emotional overload. Now that reflex begins to weaken, not because fear has disappeared entirely, but because it is no longer being triggered at the same intensity. And when fear is not constantly activated, connection is given more room to exist without immediate correction through distance. However, it is crucial not to misinterpret this stage as final resolution, because the system is still adaptive. If emotional intensity suddenly returns through pressure, expectation, or emotional escalation, the old cycle can reactivate. This is why neutrality is not a temporary tactic, but a stabilizing condition. It maintains the environment where engagement does not feel like threat. and when engagement does not feel like threat, connection can continue without triggering withdrawal as a reflex. But the moment that environment shifts back into emotional volatility, the nervous system reverts to its protective pattern. This is why consistency matters more than isolated moments of closeness. One moment of intensity cannot replace a pattern of stability. And as this balance develops, something even more interesting begins to emerge, which is that their effort starts to feel more self-initiated rather than reactive. Instead of responding only when emotionally prompted, there are moments where they engage without external emotional pressure driving it. This is a key indicator that the internal resistance has softened enough to allow voluntary connection rather than defensive interaction. But even in this stage, the engagement is still measured. It does not fully mirror the intensity of emotional openness that exists in more secure patterns. Instead, it remains careful, observant, and gradual. Because what is being built here is not instant emotional trust, but tolerance for sustained connection without internal overload. And this gradual shift is where many people begin to feel a sense of emotional reversal, as if the dynamic itself is starting to lean in the opposite direction. What once felt like chasing begins to feel like being noticed again. What once felt like withdrawal begins to feel like re-engagement. And while this can feel like being chased, what is actually happening is something more subtle. The emotional system is no longer associating your presence with pressure and therefore begins to re-enter the connection without resistance. It is not pursuit in the dramatic sense, but reapproach driven by reduced emotional threat and increased familiarity with stability. And when that reapproach begins to feel natural rather than reactive, something deeper becomes visible beneath the surface of the dynamic, because what is actually shifting is not just behavior, but emotional tolerance. The system that once required distance to regulate itself starts learning, slowly and inconsistently, that closeness does not automatically equal loss of control. And that realization does not arrive as a single breakthrough moment. It accumulates through repeated experiences where interaction no longer triggers the same internal alarm. Each calm exchange, each interaction without emotional escalation, each moment where presence is met with stability instead of pressure becomes a small recalibration. And over time, these recalibrations begin to reshape how connection is processed internally. Not as something threatening to autonomy, but as something that can exist without immediate withdrawal being necessary. And this is where the dynamic starts to feel reversed on the surface, because the same person who once pulled away at the first sign of emotional intensity now begins to stay present longer, engage more consistently, and re-enter conversation without the same hesitation. But the important detail here is that this is not chasing in the emotional sense people usually imagine. It is not urgency, it is not desperation, and it is not sudden emotional overflow. It is cautious investment being tested in real time. Because even as neutrality creates safety, the system still needs repeated confirmation that the safety is stable, so engagement becomes exploratory rather than impulsive. They are not rushing in, they are checking whether the environment still holds its previous emotional calmness before increasing involvement further. And as this pattern continues, something very subtle begins to change in how attention is distributed. Instead of connection being something they retreat from after exposure, it starts becoming something they can remain within without immediate need for distance. That does not mean avoidance disappears entirely. It simply means it is no longer automatically triggered by every interaction. There is now space between stimulus and reaction, and in that space, choice begins to appear. Choice to stay, choice to respond, choice to re-engage rather than withdraw. And this shift is often what people interpret as they are chasing now, because the absence of distance feels so different compared to the earlier pattern that any return of effort feels amplified in meaning. But what is really happening is a redefinition of emotional safety within the connection. Emotional neutrality, when maintained consistently, removes the spikes that once signaled emotional risk. And without those spikes, the nervous system begins to relax its defensive structure. That relaxation does not translate into immediate emotional openness, but it does translate into